Everyone is telling you to speak up, share your story, post the update, explain yourself, defend your name. And that advice, the advice the entire world keeps repeating, might be the exact thing keeping your life stuck in place. Because the people who actually transform, the ones who rebuild a career from nothing, repair a marriage everyone gave up on, or become someone unrecognizable from who they were 5 years ago, almost never did it loudly. They did it in a kind of silence most people are too afraid to enter. Not the silence of giving up, the silence of someone who finally stopped performing for an audience and started building something real where no one could see it yet. Here's the part that sounds backwards until you live it. The less you explain yourself, the more your life starts to organize itself. The less you announce your plans, the more those plans actually survive contact with reality. The less energy you spend managing what other people think, the more energy shows up for the one person who's been running on empty this whole time, you. This isn't about becoming cold or distant or pretending pain doesn't exist. It's almost the opposite. It's about finally directing all that scattered attention toward the one place it was always supposed to go, and discovering that most of what felt like chaos in your life was never actually chaos. It was just energy leaking in 100 directions, waiting for someone to finally close the tap. A quiet, unremarkable moment arrives, the moment a person stops needing the world's permission to move forward. And that exact moment is where everything starts shifting underneath them, long before anyone else notices a single thing has changed. Somewhere between the moment you wake up and the moment you finally lie down, most of your energy slips through your fingers without you ever noticing the leak. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in fragments, a glance at someone else's life, a comment that lingers longer than it should, a small argument replayed in your head for the 10th time. Attention is not unlimited. It's a resource, just like money or time, and yet it's the one resource people spend the most carelessly. You wouldn't hand a stranger your wallet and let them take whatever they want. But that's exactly what happens when you let comparison, unresolved conflict, and the hunger for approval dictate where your focus goes. Think about the last time you scrolled through someone's photos and felt that quiet tightening in your chest. That tightening cost you something. It pulled a piece of your presence away from your own life and handed it to someone else's. Multiply that by every day, every week, every year, and you start to understand why so many people feel exhausted without ever doing anything physically demanding. They're not tired from work. They're tired from leaking. The ancient teachers understood this long before modern psychology gave it a name. Stoic philosophers spoke of focusing only on what's within your control, your thoughts, your responses, your effort, while letting go of everything else. That single shift, when practiced daily, changes the entire architecture of a life. A man who spends his morning checking what others think of him has already lost the morning. A woman who spends her energy proving her worth to someone who never asked for proof has already lost the exchange. The leak isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a habit so familiar it feels like personality, the need to explain yourself, the urge to win an argument that doesn't even matter, the constant inner narration comparing your chapter 1 to someone else's chapter 20. If you want a concrete place to start, try this tonight. Write down every moment today when your peace depended on someone else's reaction. You'll be surprised how long that list becomes, and that list is your map of where the leak is happening. There's a particular kind of person who walks through life seeming untouched by chaos, and it's not because nothing happens to them. It's because they've learned where to put their attention and, more importantly, where not to. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private reflections not for an audience but for himself, as a way of catching his own mind before it wandered into wasted territory. That's the practice, catching yourself mid-leak. The next time you feel that pull toward checking, comparing, defending, or proving, pause for 3 seconds before acting on it. Ask yourself, quietly, where this energy is actually going. Is it going towards something that builds your life, or towards something that simply reacts to someone else's? This isn't about suppressing emotion or pretending you don't care. It's about choosing, deliberately, what deserves the gift of your focus. Books like Meditations or Ryan Holiday's The Obstacle is the Way are full of this exact teaching. Dressed in different centuries but pointing at the same truth, the world will always offer you 1,000 directions to spill your energy, and discipline is simply learning to close the tap. Picture 2 people standing at the edge of the same storm. One spends all their strength yelling at the wind, trying to control what was never theirs to control. The other plants their feet, breathes, and directs every ounce of strength toward the one thing they can actually move. Themselves, same storm. 2 completely different outcomes. That's the difference between a life that drains and a life that builds. And here's the part most people never stop to consider. Every time you reclaim a piece of that leaking energy, you're not just saving it. You're redirecting it somewhere it can actually grow something. Imagine what becomes possible when the same energy you used to spend monitoring other people's opinions gets poured into your own discipline, your own craft, your own quiet progress. That redirection alone is enough to change the trajectory of a year. But to actually close that leak, you first have to understand the difference between being quiet on the outside and being silent on the inside, because most people confuse the two, and that confusion is exactly what keeps the leak open. Most people think quiet and silent mean the same thing, and that confusion costs them more than they realize. Quiet is the absence of noise. Silent, in the way the old masters used it, is the presence of control. A person can be quiet out of fear, out of avoidance, out of simply not knowing what to say, and that's not strength, that's hiding. But a person who chooses silence, who decides deliberately not to explain, not to defend, not to react, is doing something entirely different. They're not avoiding the moment, they're mastering it. Think about the last time someone provoked you and you said nothing, not because you had no words, but because you understood that your words would have cost you more than your silence ever could. That's the line. One is running away from the room, the other is choosing not to enter the argument at all, because the argument was never worth your peace in the first place. There's an old story about a monk who was falsely accused of fathering a child. The village turned against him, demanding an explanation, demanding outrage, demanding some kind of defense. He said only, "Is that so?" and continued caring for the child as if the accusation meant nothing to his actions. Years later, when the truth came out and the real father confessed, the village came to apologize. He responded the same way. "Is that so?" That man wasn't passive. He was anchored. He understood something most people spend a lifetime missing, that explaining yourself to people who've already made up their minds is a transaction where you always lose, no matter how right you are. If you want to practice this, start small. Next time someone misunderstands your intention, resist the urge to correct them immediately. Let the misunderstanding sit for a day. Notice how much energy you save simply by not feeding it. The Bhagavad Gita speaks of action without attachment to outcome, of doing what is right without needing the world to recognize it as right. That's the same principle, dressed in a different tradition. Silence, real silence, doesn't need applause and doesn't need correction either. It simply moves forward. Compare that to passivity, which is silence born from fear. The employee who stays quiet in a meeting, not because they're strategic, but because they're terrified of being wrong. The partner who swallows their needs, not out of wisdom, but out of avoidance. That kind of silence rots a person from the inside, because nothing is being processed, only buried. The difference is intention. Strategic silence asks, will speaking change anything for the better, or will it just feed a fire that doesn't need more wood? Passive silence never asks anything at all, it just freezes. One is a sword kept sheathed on purpose. The other is a sword that was never sharpened to begin with. You'll know you've crossed from passive into strategic silence the moment you stop needing the other person to understand you. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. A man secure in his own truth doesn't need a courtroom of public opinion to validate it. A woman who knows her own worth doesn't need every comment section to agree with her choices. This is where real power starts to take shape, not in the loud declaration, but in the quiet decision to let your actions answer questions your mouth refuses to. And that quiet decision opens a door to a much harder truth, one that most people spend their entire lives avoiding the moment you stop announcing what you're about to do and simply do it. Something inside you starts to shift in a way words could never explain. Think about the last time you told someone about a goal before you'd actually started working on it. The diet that begins Monday. The business that's in the works. The book you're definitely going to write this year. There's a strange relief that comes from saying it out loud, almost as if the announcement itself counts as progress. But it doesn't. Psychologists have studied this for decades, and the pattern is consistent. When you tell people about your intentions, your brain often releases a small hit of satisfaction, the same kind of reward you'd get from actually accomplishing the thing. The problem is that satisfaction tricks your nervous system into feeling like the work is already done, which quietly drains the urgency you needed to actually do it. You spent the fuel on the announcement instead of the drive. Successful people, the ones who actually build something lasting, tend to talk less about what they're doing while they're doing it. Not because they're secretive or arrogant, but because they understand that energy spoken out loud is energy that's no longer available for the work. A founder who spends hours describing his vision at dinner parties has less left over for the unglamorous hours of actually building the product. A writer who explains the plot of her novel to everyone who asks has already used up some of the creative tension that should have gone onto the page. This isn't a rule about secrecy for its own sake. It's about understanding where your energy belongs. If you're working on something right now, a career change, a fitness goal, a relationship repair, try this for 30 days. Tell no one. Let your actions be the only announcement. Watch how differently you show up when there's no audience expecting updates. James Clear writes about this in Atomic Habits, describing how identity is built through repeated action, not through declared intention. Saying I'm a runner means nothing if you haven't laced up your shoes in 3 weeks. But running quietly, consistently, without telling anyone for long enough, that's what actually rewires who you are. The same applies to spiritual growth. Someone who announces they're working on their patience while still snapping at every inconvenience hasn't built patience. They've built a narrative. Real transformation rarely announces itself because real transformation is busy doing the work, not describing the work. There's a kind of humility in this too. Building in private means you're not performing growth for an audience, you're actually becoming something, brick by brick, with no one clapping along the way. Here's the part that stings a little. A lot of announcing is actually fear in disguise. Fear that if you don't say it out loud, you won't follow through. Fear that if no one's watching, you'll quit. But that fear reveals something important. It shows you're relying on external pressure instead of internal discipline. The moment you stop needing witnesses to hold yourself accountable is the moment you actually start to change. Try keeping your next big goal completely private for a season. No posts, no dinner conversations, no just so you know updates. Let the results speak when they're finished, not the plans while they're forming. And once you experience what it feels like to build in total silence, something else starts to surface, an uncomfortable mirror, one that shows you exactly who you are when no one's there to perform for. Strip away the noise of other people's opinions, take away the comparisons, mute the constant feedback loop of likes and reactions and validation, and what's left? That question terrifies more people than they'd ever admit, because when the external noise finally goes quiet, there's nowhere left to hide from your own reflection. No one to blame for the unfinished projects. No external villain to explain why the relationship keeps repeating the same pattern. No audience to perform progress for. Just you, your choices, and the accumulated weight of every excuse you've used to avoid looking directly at your own responsibility. This is exactly why so many people fill their lives with constant noise, music playing in every room, notifications buzzing every few minutes, conversations about everyone except themselves. Silence forces a confrontation that noise lets you postpone indefinitely. Carl Jung called this confrontation with the unfiltered self the descent into the shadow, the parts of you that get buried, denied, or projected onto other people because looking at them directly feels unbearable. The coworker who irritates you beyond reason might be reflecting a trait you've refused to acknowledge in yourself. The relationship pattern that keeps repeating with different faces but the same ending is rarely about bad luck. It's usually the same unresolved wound dressed in a new disguise. A man who blames every failed partnership on choosing the wrong people eventually has to ask why the pattern keeps choosing him. A woman who insists every job ends badly because of toxic bosses eventually has to examine what she's bringing into every room before the boss does anything at all. This isn't about self-blame. It's about ownership, and ownership is the only door that actually leads somewhere. The practice that opens this door is brutally simple and brutally uncomfortable. Sit in silence, alone, with no phone, no music, no distraction, for 20 minutes, and let your mind go wherever it wants to go. Most people can't make it past 5 minutes before reaching for a screen, because what surfaces in that silence is usually something they've been outrunning for years. Try it tonight. Don't journal yet, don't analyze yet, just sit and notice what comes up uninvited. That discomfort you feel is not a sign you're doing it wrong. It's a sign the mirror is finally working. Marcus Aurelius retreated into his own mind nightly for this exact reason, not to escape responsibility, but to face it without distraction, writing down what he saw so he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen it. What makes this mirror so hard to face isn't the flaws themselves. Everyone has flaws. Everyone already half knows their own weaknesses. What makes it unbearable is the silence required to actually see them clearly, without the comforting static of other people's noise to drown them out. But here's the strange gift hiding inside that discomfort. The same silence that reveals your shadow also reveals exactly where your energy has been going, who you've been performing for, and which relationships only survived because you kept showing up as someone you're not. And once that becomes visible, you can't unsee it, which means the people who only loved the performance start to fall away, whether you push them or not. Here's something nobody warns you about on the path toward genuine self-respect. Some people will leave. Not because you became worse, but because you stopped being useful to the role they needed you to play. The friend who only called when they needed someone to validate their bad decisions. The partner who loved the version of you that asked for permission before having an opinion. The family member who appreciated you most when you were small enough not to threaten their own comfort. When you stop performing, stop shrinking, stop over-explaining, stop seeking approval before making a move, some relationships simply can't survive the new shape you've become. And that loss, as sharp as it feels in the moment, is rarely a tragedy. It's usually a quiet form of evidence that you're finally taking up the space you were always meant to occupy. Think about the kind of connection built entirely on your need for approval. Every time you agreed when you actually disagreed, every time you laughed at something that wasn't funny, every time you said "I'm fine" while clearly not being fine, those moments built a relationship with a version of you that doesn't actually exist. So when the real version shows up, the one with boundaries, the one with opinions, the one who no longer needs a stamp of approval to feel like their choices are valid, it's not surprising that some people don't recognize them, or worse, resent them for changing the terms. Brené Brown writes extensively about this in her work on vulnerability and belonging, the idea that true belonging never requires you to change who you are. It only requires you to be who you are. Anything else is just a more exhausting form of loneliness, dressed up to look like connection. This is where most people freeze, because losing someone, even someone who was draining you, still feels like loss. Grief doesn't check your logic before it shows up. You can know, intellectually, that a relationship was built on your silence and self-erasure, and still feel a pang when it ends. Both things are true at once. The ending is necessary, and it still hurts. Give yourself permission to feel that without rushing to fix it or numb it. What helps, practically, is shifting the question from "why did they leave?" to "what was I providing that I'm no longer willing to provide?" That single reframe turns grief into clarity. It's not abandonment. It's a recalibration of who actually belongs in the next chapter of your life, based on who you're becoming rather than who you used to perform as. The people who stay through this transition, and some will, are the ones who were never attached to the performance in the first place. They liked you, the real one, even when the real one was less convenient, less agreeable, less available for emotional labor. Those relationships often deepen during this period, even if they shrink in number. Quality replaces quantity, depth replaces noise. And once you start noticing which relationships survive your honesty, you start to understand something most people never figure out. There's a season coming, quiet and unglamorous, where none of this growth will be visible to anyone watching, and that season is exactly where the next version of you gets built. Every transformation worth having moves through a stretch of time where absolutely nothing seems to be happening on the outside. No applause, no progress photos, no milestone to post about, just the same unglamorous repetition day after day, with no guarantee it's even working. This is the season most people quit in, not because the work is too hard, but because the silence around it feels like proof of failure. It isn't. It's actually the most honest period of growth a person ever goes through, because nothing is being done for show. The gym session with no one watching. The hour of practice on an instrument nobody's heard yet. The early mornings spent studying a craft that hasn't paid off a single dollar. That invisible repetition is where character actually gets built, brick by brick, far from any stage. Athletes understand this better than almost anyone. The years before a single victory gets televised are filled with thousands of repetitions no camera ever captured. The missed shots, the failed lifts, the mornings the body refused to cooperate. Kobe Bryant famously trained before sunrise specifically because no one else was awake to witness it, not for the discipline of secrecy itself, but because he understood that the version of himself capable of greatness had to be built somewhere quiet, somewhere unmonitored, somewhere free from the pressure of an audience grading every attempt. That's the paradox of this season. It demands the most consistency precisely when it offers the least reward. If you're in that stretch right now, building a skill, healing from something, rebuilding trust with yourself, know that the absence of recognition is not the absence of progress. The hardest part of this season isn't the labor. It's the doubt that creeps in when comparison enters the picture. Watching someone else's highlight reel while you're still in your rough draft phase can make the invisible season feel unbearable. This is exactly where the discipline from earlier topics becomes essential. The ability to redirect attention inward instead of outward, the willingness to stay silent about your process instead of explaining it to anyone who asks. Try keeping a private log just for yourself, tracking small wins no one else needs to know about. Not for accountability to others, but to remind yourself on the hardest days that the repetition is actually accumulating into something. Ryan Holiday calls this the canvas strategy in his writing, doing work that serves the larger goal without needing credit for it, letting the result speak when it's finally ready to. What's strange about this season is that it ends quietly too. No clear finish line announces itself, no trumpet sounds to mark that the invisible work has finally paid off. One day you simply notice you've become someone slightly different, calmer under pressure, more capable under stress, less rattled by things that used to wreck your entire week. That shift didn't happen during one dramatic moment. It happened in the thousands of unnoticed repetitions that came before it. And once you've lived through that season, once you understand what it costs to build something with no witnesses, a strange new skill starts to emerge, the ability to pause, even for a second, before reacting to anything at all, because you've finally learned what real patience under construction actually feels like. Right before every reaction, a window opens, small, often invisible, lasting maybe a second or two. And inside that window lives every bit of freedom a person actually has. Most people never notice it exists because their reactions feel automatic, instant, almost involuntary, like a reflex. The insult lands and the comeback fires before any real thought happens. The bad news arrives, and panic takes over before the facts are even fully understood. But that gap between what happens and how you respond to it is real, and it's wider than most people ever train themselves to use. Viktor Frankl, writing from inside a concentration camp, the most extreme circumstance imaginable for testing this idea, observed that even when every external freedom is stripped away, one freedom remains untouched: the ability to choose your response to what's happening to you. If that space can survive in conditions like that, it can survive a rude email or a frustrating conversation with your mother-in-law. The practice of widening that gap starts small and feels almost silly at first. Before reacting to anything that triggers you, count to 3 in your head. Just 3 seconds. In that pause, the part of your brain responsible for impulsive reaction, the amygdala, gets a brief moment to hand control back to the part responsible for reasoned thought. 3 seconds sounds insignificant until you actually try it during a real argument, a real provocation, a real moment of being cut off in traffic by someone clearly in a hurry to die. The pause doesn't eliminate the feeling, it just stops the feeling from making the decision on your behalf. Try it the next time someone sends a message that makes your chest tighten. Read it, feel the reaction rising, and instead of typing immediately, put the phone down for 3 full seconds before responding. That tiny delay has ended more arguments than any clever comeback ever could. What makes this practice so powerful is that it puts you back in the driver's seat of your own nervous system instead of letting circumstances drive for you. A person who reacts instantly to everything is, in a strange way, not actually free. They're being controlled, moment to moment, by whatever happens to them externally. A person who pauses, even briefly, before responding, has reclaimed something most people never even realize they lost: authorship over their own behavior. This isn't about suppressing anger or pretending to be calm when you're not. It's about choosing, on purpose, what to do with the anger once it arrives, whether to let it speak for you or whether you'll speak for yourself, with clarity, after the wave passes. Stoic philosophy calls this the practice of the pause, and modern neuroscience backs it almost entirely. The brain's most reactive circuits fire fast, but they also fade fast, usually within 90 seconds if you let them. Once you start practicing this pause consistently, something curious happens. Moments that used to wreck your entire day start to lose their grip almost immediately. The driver who cut you off stops ruining your morning. The comment that used to sting for hours barely registers by lunchtime. You begin to realize that most of your suffering wasn't coming from what happened to you, but from how quickly you handed your peace over to it. And that realization opens a much harder question, one that takes real courage to sit with. If pain and discomfort are inevitable, no matter how much space you create, what's the difference between using that pain as an excuse to stay stuck and using it as the exact fuel that pushes you forward? Pain is real. Whatever happened to you, the betrayal, the loss, the childhood that left scars no one else could see, the version of yourself that got hurt trying to trust someone who didn't deserve it, none of that gets dismissed here. Validating pain matters, and anyone who tells you to just get over it without acknowledging the weight of what happened is offering a shortcut that doesn't actually heal anything. But here's the distinction that changes everything. Feeling your pain and using your pain as a permanent excuse to stay stuck are two completely different things. One honors what happened to you. The other lets what happened to you write the rest of your story without your permission. Both can't be true forever. At some point, the same event has to stop being the reason you're frozen and start being the reason you move. Consider two people who experienced nearly identical hardship, both lost a parent young, both grew up with financial instability, both faced rejection that left lasting marks. One uses that history as the explanation for every failed relationship, every unfinished goal, every excuse not to try. The other uses that exact same history as the reason they refuse to let their own children inherit the same instability, the reason they wake up earlier, work harder, heal louder than the wound ever screamed. The event was the same. The relationship to the event was the choice. Viktor Frankl, who survived horrors most people can't fully comprehend, wrote that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. That doesn't mean the suffering disappears. It means the suffering gets pointed somewhere instead of just sitting there rotting into identity. This is delicate territory because the line between honoring pain and hiding behind it isn't always obvious, even to the person living it. A useful practice here is asking yourself one direct question whenever an old wound shows up in a new decision. Am I protecting myself, or am I avoiding growth using the language of protection? Sometimes the answer is genuinely the first one. Some situations really do require distance, boundaries, retreat. But often, if you're honest, the answer is the second one, dressed up convincingly as self-care. Journaling through this question, writing the actual sentence and answering it without editing yourself, tends to expose the truth faster than simply thinking about it ever could. The pain doesn't lie. But the stories built around the pain very often do. What separates people who transform their pain from people who stay trapped by it usually isn't the size of the wound, it's the decision, made repeatedly, to keep functioning despite it. Not without it. Despite it. The wound doesn't have to close completely before you start building. Most people who've built something meaningful did it with the wound still partially open, using the discomfort as a kind of pressure that pushed them forward instead of waiting for a comfort that may never fully arrive. And once pain stops being your prison and starts being your fuel, an uncomfortable question rises to meet you. How much of your life right now is dedicated to managing how you appear to others, instead of simply becoming who you actually are underneath all that managing? There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical effort. The exhaustion of maintaining two different versions of yourself. One version exists for the public, curated, composed, careful about what gets shown and what stays hidden. The other version exists in private, messier, more honest, closer to who you actually are when no one's grading the performance. Most people don't even realize how much energy this division consumes until they finally stop doing it. Carl Jung called the public version the persona, a necessary mask for navigating social life, useful in small doses, dangerous when mistaken for identity itself. The danger isn't wearing the mask occasionally. The danger is forgetting you're wearing one, until the mask becomes more familiar than the face underneath it. Think about how much mental bandwidth gets spent managing image rather than building substance. Choosing words carefully, not because they're true, but because they're safe. Posting a version of a vacation, a relationship, a career milestone that's been edited for maximum approval rather than maximum honesty. Staying quiet about a struggle, not because silence is strategic here, but because admitting struggle threatens the image being maintained. That kind of energy expenditure adds up to something enormous over a lifetime. And the return on that investment is thinner than people expect. Approval from people who only ever met the edited version, never the real one. Compare that to the quiet relief of someone who's stopped managing their image altogether, who says what they actually think, who shows up to a room as the same person they are alone in their car. That person isn't perfect, but they're whole, and wholeness, once tasted, makes the old performance feel unbearable by comparison. Jordan Peterson often speaks about the cost of living a lie of self-presentation, how each small dishonesty about who you are compounds until eventually a person can't locate their own values underneath the accumulated performance. Reversing this doesn't require a dramatic announcement or a public confession. It starts small, telling one person the truth you've been editing for them. Saying, actually, I disagree in a meeting instead of nodding along. Admitting I don't know instead of performing confidence you don't have. Each small act of coherence between the inside and the outside rebuilds a kind of trust with yourself that image management slowly erodes. Try it once this week, pick one relationship, and bring slightly more of your real self into it than you normally would. Notice how much lighter that conversation feels afterward, even if it's a little more uncomfortable in the moment. The new source of respect, the kind that actually sustains a person long-term, doesn't come from how polished the image looks from the outside. It comes from internal coherence, the simple, rare experience of being the same person across every room you walk into. That consistency becomes its own quiet form of strength, one that doesn't need an audience to confirm it's real. And once that coherence becomes a daily practice, instead of an occasional effort, something final starts to take shape. A kind of presence that no longer needs anyone's permission to exist exactly as it is. Picture someone who walks into a room and doesn't need to announce their accomplishments, doesn't need to perform confidence, doesn't need the conversation to revolve around them in order to feel secure. They listen more than they speak, not because they have nothing to say, but because they no longer need speaking to be a means of being seen. That kind of presence is rare, and almost everyone who encounters it feels something shift in the room, not because the person demanded attention, but because they clearly didn't need it. This is the final shape of everything explored up to this point. A person who has stopped leaking energy into comparison, stopped confusing passivity with real silence, stopped announcing intentions before building them, faced their own reflection honestly, released relationships built on performance, survived the invisible season, learned to pause before reacting, transformed pain into fuel instead of excuse, and closed the gap between who they appear to be and who they actually are. This kind of power doesn't look like power in the traditional sense. It doesn't shout, doesn't dominate a room, doesn't need to win every argument to feel secure in being right. Lao Tzu wrote extensively about this paradox in the Tao Te Ching. The idea that true strength often looks like softness from the outside, that water, the gentlest substance imaginable, eventually carves through stone simply by persisting without needing to force anything. A person who has done this inner work moves through the world the same way. They don't need the relationship to constantly prove its security through reassurance. They don't need the job to constantly prove their worth through recognition. They don't need the room to constantly prove their value through applause. The proving stopped being necessary the moment the inner foundation became solid enough to hold its own weight. This is the version of you that's been quietly forming through every uncomfortable practice covered so far. The redirected attention, the strategic silence, the private building, the honest mirror, the relationships that fell away, the unwitnessed seasons, the conscious pause, the repurposed pain, the closed gap between image and substance. None of it happened in one dramatic transformation. It happened the same way water carves stone, slowly, repeatedly, without an audience keeping score. And the strange thing about reaching this place is that it rarely feels like arrival. It feels quieter than that, less like a finish line crossed, and more like static, finally clearing from a radio that's been buzzing your entire life. What remains, once all that noise settles, isn't loud confidence or constant certainty. It's something steadier than both, a kind of rest inside your own existence, a willingness to act, pause, rest, and relate to others without needing any of it validated from the outside. That's the actual destination this entire path was leading toward quietly the whole time. Not becoming someone impressive to others, becoming someone undivided within yourself.